Imagine you've ordered something special online, maybe a unique handcrafted gift, from an artisan, or that very specific, hard-to-find part you really need for a passion project. You've clicked buy, you're excited, tracking the shipment, and then suddenly your order is delayed, indefinitely. Or maybe the price unexpectedly jumps through the roof, leaving you just scratching your head, wondering what on earth just happened. What if this seemingly small inconvenience, this personal frustration, is actually a direct, undeniable ripple effect of massive kind of hidden economic and geopolitical dance playing out on the global stage? Today, we're taking a deep dive into precisely that. The complex, often counterintuitive world of U.S. trade policy. Specifically, we're really going to dissect the Trump administration's escalating tariffs. We're going to explore not only their true economic impact right here at home, affecting your wallet directly and frankly profoundly, but also their deep and far-reaching ripple effects on international relations. And, maybe most surprisingly, we'll uncover the often overlooked and honestly incredibly creative ways nations are pushing back against these policies. For this deep dive, we've gathered several crucial sources, detailed economic analyses that really break down the true cost of tariffs on American households, a breaking report on a startling parcel pause initiated by India and the European Union just this week, and some truly witty, insightful commentary on India's unique and, well, unconventional response to these trade tensions. Our mission today is to unpack these layers for you, our listeners. We want to reveal what these policies truly mean for your everyday life, for global trade, for these complex geopolitical relationships, and maybe even for the very nature of international influence itself. So get ready for some potentially eye-opening revelations. Because what you think you know about tariffs, like who pays them, why they exist, and how nations fight back, might be about to get a serious shakeup, and it impacts your wallet and the world around you directly. Okay, let's unpack this first big piece. When we hear about tariffs, there's a common phrase, right? It often comes up in political discourse.
Foreign countries are paying. It's a compelling idea, isn't it? The notion that someone else, some distant competitor, is footing the bill for these taxes. But our sources, they reveal a very different reality, one that might genuinely surprise you.
Yeah, what truly stands out here is how the mechanics actually work behind the scenes. The sources make it abundantly clear, really, that the widely held belief about tariffs being paid by foreign nations is, well, it's basically a political illusion. They're not paid by China or India or Europe. Instead, tariffs are effectively a hidden sales tax. They get embedded right into our supply chains, and ultimately they land on the American consumer.
So if it's not China or India footing the bill, and it's actually us, the American consumer, why is this narrative of foreign countries are paying so prevalent? What makes it such a powerful illusion for so long?
That's a really crucial point. It's powerful because it appeals to a sense of fairness, maybe, and protection for domestic industry. A feeling that, we're making other countries pay for what are perceived as unfair trade practices. The language is simple and direct. They pay. But the actual process, it's far more nuanced. Tariffs are taxes, plain and simple.
Yeah.
They're collected right at the U.S. border by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. And crucially, they are paid directly by American importers, the U.S. companies bringing goods into the country.
Right, the American companies themselves.
Exactly. Think about it. If a large retailer is importing electronics from, say, Vietnam, or maybe a small business is bringing in specialty textiles from India, that tariff, that's an immediate additional cost to their business right here in the U.S. And these importers, almost without exception, they do not just absorb these costs. They're not charities, right?
Right, they have to make a profit.
They pass them along. They pass them along to you, the consumer, in the form of higher prices. It's simply built into the final retail price you see on the shelf or online.
So it's not even like a separate line item on your receipt that says tariff cost.
Okay.
It's just baked in like a stealth charge that just makes everything subtly more expensive. You don't see it broken out. It's just there.
Precisely. It's like a sales tax, as you said, but one that's completely hidden. It's not transparently printed on your receipt. It's so deeply embedded into the final price of the goods you buy that it becomes incredibly difficult for the average person, for you, to trace the direct impact. And this lack of transparency, that's really key to the illusion. It allows the political narrative to persist, even as American families are silently bearing the financial burden.
Okay, so if it's Americans paying, what does that actually look like in, everyday life? How much more are we talking about here in real dollars and cents?
Yeah, that begs the question, doesn't it? And our sources, they cite the Congressional Budget Office, independent economists. They paint a very clear and honestly somewhat alarming picture of just how much this hidden tax is costing families. During the previous round, the 2018-2020 tariff wars, U.S. households paid an estimated $800 to $1,300 more per year.
$800 to $1,300.
Yeah. To give that some context, for many families, that's like a month's worth of groceries, right? Or a significant car repair bill, or a good chunk of a family vacation wiped out. And now, with the upcoming 2025 tariff escalations, which are expected to cover hundreds of billions more in goods, these costs are projected to rise even higher. We're potentially looking at topping $1,500 annually per family.
$1,500 a year. That's a substantial hit to disposable income.
It really is. Especially when you consider it's a cost you can't easily avoid if you buy imported goods, which, let's face it, most of us do every day.
That's a huge difference. Can you give us some maybe concrete examples to really drive home what that means? I mean, where would I actually see this extra $1,500 showing up in my budget?
Absolutely. Let's break it down into tangible purchases. So imagine a 25% tariff is slapped onto a $1,000 washing machine. That adds $250 directly to its cost for the importer.
Which means it adds $250 for me when I buy it.
Ultimately, yes. Or think about smaller electronics. A 10% tariff on common items like smartphones or laptops. That can easily add $1,500 per device. If you replace your phone every couple of years, well, there's an extra $50 or $100 just built into that price. And it's not just the big-ticket items either.
Right, it's the everyday stuff, too.
Exactly. Think about clothing, footwear categories, often heavily imported from Asia. Certain garments could see markups of 15, 20%. Even everyday household items, tools, kids' toys, anything imported is potentially subject to these tariffs. So if you're, furnishing a home, buying new clothes for the family, stocking up on school supplies, these costs accumulate really fast and often invisibly.
And it disproportionately hits certain families harder, doesn't it? It's not like this cost is evenly distributed across the income spectrum.
Yes, that's a critical point, and the sources really emphasize this. These tariffs are described as regressive in nature, which basically means they disproportionately impact lower and middle income families. Why? Because these households spend a much larger share of their total income on goods. Physical things compared to higher income families who might spend more on services or investments or luxury experiences.
So a flat increase hurts more if you have less to begin with.
Exactly. A flat increase in the cost of essential goods means a significantly heavier burden on those with less disposable income. It effectively widens the gap. And beyond our individual wallets, if we connect this to the bigger picture of the macroeconomy, tariffs are, they're inherently anti-growth. Our sources highlight them quite starkly, actually, calling them growth killers. They're not just about higher prices for you. They create this kind of pervasive ripple effect that slows down the entire economy. It impacts far more than just what you pay at the register.
Anti-growth. That
Yeah.
sounds almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? For a policy that's often framed as protecting the economy, how exactly do they kill growth? What's the mechanism there beyond just making things more expensive for consumers?
Well, fundamentally, they distort markets. That means they push economic activity away from its most efficient and productive paths. Businesses that rely on imported components or goods suddenly face these unpredictable and higher costs. That makes them less competitive both domestically and globally. And this uncertainty, this instability in costs, it discourages investment. Businesses become hesitant to commit capital when their supply chains and pricing are constantly in flux,
Makes sense. Hard to plan long term.
Exactly. And fundamentally, these higher costs combine to slow down overall consumer spending. When prices are higher because of tariffs, consumers just have less purchasing power left over. So they buy less across the board, not just of the tariffed goods. And this reduced demand then leads businesses to shrink their output, maybe postpone expansion plans, which can unfortunately result in job losses across various industries, not just retail, certainly, but also in logistics, shipping, port operations, even some manufacturing sectors that rely heavily on imported parts.
It becomes a vicious cycle almost.
It can be, yeah. It can choke off that economic dynamism you need for healthy growth.
And we've seen historical examples of this playing out with pretty devastating consequences, haven't we? History has some warnings here.
Indeed, it does. The notorious Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s serve as a stark, almost textbook reminder of how protectionist policies can severely dampen economic activity. They're widely seen as contributing to the severity of the Great Depression. The sources underscore this historical precedent, basically issuing a clear warning. We should probably learn from past mistakes rather than repeat them. And the impact isn't just theoretical from the distant past either. The more recent 2018-2019 tariff battles, for instance, shaved an estimated zero point 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points off U.S. GDP growth annually.
0.3 to 0.5%.
Yeah.
That might sound small to some listeners.
It might sound small, but even a fraction of a percentage point in GDP growth represents billions and billions of dollars in lost economic activity. That translates to lost wages, lost business opportunities, and thousands of potential jobs across the nation that just didn't materialize. It adds up quickly.
And looking forward to these planned 2025 escalations, are we expecting a similar kind of impact or potentially worse given the broader scope?
Well, forecasters, including those cited in our sources like the Yale Budget Lab, are warning of a similar or even greater drag from the 2025 tariff regime. They're projecting it could potentially cut GDP growth by another 0.5 percentage points. Now, when you consider that the U.S. average annual growth rate since the year 2000 has been hovering around 2.2%, losing another half a percentage point, that's a very significant hit to the nation's economic momentum.
Like tapping the brakes on the whole economy.
Yeah, it's essentially applying the brakes to an already complex economic engine, and maybe at a time when you'd really want robust growth to manage other fiscal challenges.
And the scale of this tax hit from tariffs is actually quite unprecedented in modern history, isn't it? The numbers our sources cite are truly staggering when you look at them.
They really are. The sources present some, frankly, jaw-dropping figures here, emphasizing the sheer scope of this policy shift. The Yale Budget Lab, for example, reports that the Trump administration has already raised the average effective tariff rate, what Americans actually pay, to 18.6%. Yeah, that is a towering figure. And it's dangerously close to the devastating 19.8% rate imposed by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act back in 1930, the very act we just discussed that notoriously helped plunge the U.S. economy into the Great Depression.
Wow. That historical comparison alone really should be a serious red flag, shouldn't it?
It definitely puts it into a stark historical context, yeah. Makes you sit up and pay attention.
And what about the financial scope? Just how much money are we talking about being pulled out of the economy annually by these tariffs?
The financial scope is immense. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation predicts a run rate of $210 billion annually by the end of 2025, assuming these tariffs go into effect as planned.
$210 billion a year.
A year. To put that in perspective, that equates to over 9% of all personal income taxes collected. And maybe even more strikingly, it's about 40%, 40% of all corporate taxes paid in 2024.
40% of corporate taxes, that's huge.
It's huge. This is not a trivial amount. It's a colossal sum that directly impacts consumer spending power and business investment decisions. The sources even state unequivocally that the Trump tariffs, if fully implemented, will amount to one of the largest tax hits in U.S. history. And looking further out, the Yale Budget Lab projects that these tariffs will lift a total of $2.7 trillion with a T from Americans' pockets through the year 2034.
$2.7 trillion. That's a colossal long-term burden.
It is. It impacts economic growth, individual prosperity, everything for years and years to come.
And there's a fascinating paradox here that the sources point out, isn't there, about tax cuts being put in one pocket only for these tariffs to take money out of the other.
Absolutely. It's a remarkable kind of fiscal sleight of hand, if you will. The sources highlight that Trump's tariffs, these new ones, will effectively grab back about half of the projected tax savings from his other proposed tax cuts.
Half.
Roughly half. So while money might be put into families' pockets with one hand through, say, income tax reductions, a big chunk of it is taken right back out with the other hand through these hidden tariff taxes. It essentially dilutes or even negates the intended benefit of those tax cuts for many families, leaving them perhaps no better off and potentially even worse off once you consider the full picture of taxes and prices.
Okay, so if prices are going up because of tariffs, are we talking about inflation here? Is this part of the bigger inflation conversation we've all been having for the past couple of years? Or is there a crucial distinction we need to make?
This is a really crucial point for critical thinking, and the sources are very, very clear in this distinction. Our sources remind us of the legendary economist Milton Friedman's famous assertion: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, meaning it's driven primarily by the money supply. This is a very specific and, academically rigorous definition that separates overall inflation from just price increases on specific goods due to things like tariffs or supply chain issues.
Can you elaborate on that distinction a bit? How does Friedman's view apply here, and why is it important not to just lump tariffs in with general inflation?
Certainly. Friedman's core point is that true, broad-based, persistent inflation, meaning, the overall cost of living going up significantly year after year, say annual rates exceeding 4% for at least 2 years, that's directly linked to an excessive increase in the amount of money circulating in the economy. We saw this quite distinctly recently, didn't we? The surge in the U.S. money supply, measured by M2 post-pandemic, it peaked at an astonishing 26.7% annual growth back in February 2021. And that directly preceded the big inflation surge of 2021-2022. That inflation wasn't caused by, supply chain glitches alone or other non-monetary factors, the sources argue pretty strongly. It was, as they put it, pure and simple, by the surge in the money supply.
Okay, so that's the monetary phenomenon part.
Yeah, exactly. So to be absolutely clear for our listeners, a tariff-driven price increase on, say, that washing machine we talked about means you pay more for that specific item. But it doesn't, on its own, cause the overall cost of living, everything from your rent to your gas to your groceries, to broadly inflate in that Friedman sense. Unless, and this is the key caveat, unless the Federal Reserve then prints more money, increases the money supply to accommodate those higher prices across the board. It's a critical distinction between a specific relative price hike and a systemic, monetary-driven inflation issue.
So how do tariffs fit into this price picture if they aren't the primary driver of overall inflation in that specific sense?
Right. Tariffs increase the relative prices of imported goods, so those specific things get more expensive compared to other things. But according to this view, they won't change the overall price index significantly unless the Fed increases the money supply to compensate. What typically happens, the theory goes, is that Americans will simply spend more on the tariffed goods because they have to, maybe. And consequently, they'll have less money left over to spend on non-imported goods and services, things produced domestically.
So it shifts spending around.
Exactly. The sources suggest it's more or less a wash for the overall price level. The extra money spent on tariffed goods essentially matches the drop in what's spent on everything else. The specter of overall inflation, in Friedman's sense, only really reappears if the Fed decides to balloon the money supply to offset this shift in spending patterns. And, what's often misunderstood in these discussions is the root cause of the trade deficit itself. It's often framed politically as being about, nefarious foreign activities or countries cheating us, but the sources are very clear that this is largely a misunderstanding.
Okay, if it's not about foreign countries cheating, then what is it about? What's the fundamental driver of the U.S. trade deficit, according to these analyses?
Well, the trade deficit arises from a fundamental domestic choice, really. It's the U.S. choice to consume more than it produces domestically. It's almost an economic identity, a mathematical truth baked into national accounting. The difference between what a nation spends and what it produces domestically must equal its trade deficit. So in 2024, for example, the U.S. spent roughly $31.2 trillion but only produced $30.33 trillion worth of goods and services domestically.
And that gap?
That $872.5 billion difference, that precisely equaled the overall trade deficit. It's an accounting identity.
So we're essentially importing the difference because as a nation, we're simply consuming more stuff than we're making here at home. It's really a reflection of our own collective economic behavior.
Exactly. It's a choice we've effectively made as Americans over decades to consume much more than we make. And these deficits, historically, have been relatively easy for the U.S. to finance. Why? Because of the dollar's exorbitant privilege.
The exorbitant privilege. Explain that quickly.
Right. It's a key economic concept. It basically means the U.S. dollar, being the world's primary reserve currency, allows us to run larger trade deficits than other countries could sustain. Foreign nations and investors are always willing, even eager, to hold dollars and invest their capital here in the U.S., buying stocks, bonds, real estate. They essentially lend us the money to consume more than we produce. It's a unique advantage that other countries don't have, and it fundamentally shapes our trade balance. So the deficit is partly a structural aspect of the U.S. economy's global role, not solely a result of unfair foreign practices that can just be fixed with tariffs. Tariffs don't really address that core consumption-production gap.
Okay, so it sounds like this narrative about foreign countries paying, and the whole reasoning behind tariffs, while maybe politically convenient in the short term, is built on a foundation that could eventually crumble as people really start to feel the pinch in their own budgets.
Absolutely, and the sources definitely predict a potential political reckoning down the line. The China is paying narrative or Mexico is paying, it provides short-term political cover. It offers easy sound bites about, protecting American workers or leveling the playing field. But the sources warn that this narrative inevitably collapses as voters begin to actually feel the rising prices for everyday essentials, groceries, clothes, household items, electronics. The political question isn't if voters will notice, but when they will connect the dots between these tariff policies and their own shrinking wallets.
Especially with the memory of recent inflation still so fresh.
Exactly. That makes people particularly sensitive to price increases right now. The patience for another hidden tax, especially one that wasn't clearly explained, might be quite thin, potentially leading to significant electoral backlash down the road.
It's all about that moment, isn't it? When the impact becomes undeniable for people, moving from some abstract policy debate in Washington to a very personal economic burden felt at the kitchen table.
Precisely. Unlike abstract debates about trade deficits or international sanctions regimes, higher consumer costs are tangible, they're personal, and they can be politically explosive. Once the disguise is stripped away, tariffs will likely be seen by many for what the economists say they are: stealth taxes on American households, a brake on economic growth, and potentially a recipe for voter disillusionment. The average American voter, our sources suggest, will eventually wake up and call the bluff, demanding accountability for policies that directly hit their pocketbooks.
And as we've been discussing this, for those watching, you've been seeing a visual that really brings these points home. We're showing you a combined infographic that clearly illustrates these key economic points. You'll see these blue bars representing the rising annual household costs of tariffs, showing an estimated $1,050 per year during 2018-2020, rising sharply to a projected $1,500 in 2025 under the new proposals. And then there's an orange line tracking the corresponding drag on GDP growth, showing a reduction of maybe 0.4 percentage points back in 2018-2019, projected to increase to 0.5 percentage points in 2025. The message is pretty clear, isn't it? Tariffs act as hidden sales taxes. Families pay more while the economy slows. It's a stark, almost undeniable picture of the economic reality presented by these sources. So we've clearly seen how these tariffs create a kind of hidden tax right here at home, costing American families significant money and potentially slowing our overall economy. But the economic ripples, they don't just stop at our borders, do they? Our sources reveal a truly unexpected international reaction that could directly impact your next online order, making you wonder if that shipment delayed notification you just got is actually a cleverly disguised act of global pushback. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, hits close to home for anyone who shops online internationally. Imagine a major chunk of your international online orders suddenly just stopping. You click buy, you get a confirmation email, maybe you track it for a day or two, but then you get a notification. Shipment paused indefinitely. That's apparently exactly what happened this week, sending some serious shockwaves through the global e-commerce world.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, what you're seeing is a unique and, I think, quite powerful form of soft power in action. Postal authorities in India and right across the European Union have announced a strategic pause. They're suspending most parcel shipments to the United States. And this isn't just a minor delay we're talking about. It's a significant, seemingly coordinated disruption in the global supply chain, specifically targeting those small packages that affect everyday consumers and small businesses alike.
Wow. And what's the immediate trigger for this sudden, almost unprecedented halt in shipments from major partners like India and the EU?
Well, this maneuver, which became effective almost immediately or within days, right around August 25th, 2025, is described as a direct, calculated response to the Trump administration's impending tariff overhaul. Specifically, the changes to how small packages are handled. It's essentially a preemptive move. They're trying to avoid what these foreign postal systems are calling an operational minefield. They seem to be simply refusing to navigate a system they currently deem unworkable and chaotic.
An operational minefield, that's a really strong phrase. What specifically is causing that level of concern among these international postal services? What's the core problem?
Right. At the heart of this disruption is the Trump administration's plan to terminate the decades-old de minimis exemption. That was set to take effect August 29, 2025. Now, this policy, the de minimis rule, previously allowed U.S. consumers, to receive packages worth up to $800 from abroad completely duty-free and without a ton of burdensome customs paperwork.
Ah, the $800 limit. I remember that.
Yeah.
That fueled a lot of online shopping.
It profoundly fueled cross-border e-commerce. Giants like Temu, AliExpress, Shein, and also countless small businesses, maybe artisans in India selling via platforms like Etsy, Amazon Marketplace, Shopify. They all relied heavily on that $800 threshold. It was really a cornerstone of affordable international online shopping for millions of Americans.
So that $800 duty-free limit is essentially going away or being drastically changed. And that's creating not just potentially higher costs, but a complete logistical nightmare for the shippers.
Precisely. That relatively simple duty-free regime is ending. Under the new tariff system, new import tariffs are being imposed, up to 15% on goods from Europe, and variable duties, depending on the product, on imports from India and other nations, even for these small parcels. But the critical problem, according to our sources covering this pause, is that U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, has apparently failed to provide a clear, comprehensive implementation roadmap before the deadline.
No clear rules.
We're talking things like no finalized duty tables for all these different products, incomplete guidance on the new forms required, significant uncertainty around exemptions, classifications, just a lack of clarity. Now imagine the sheer volume. Millions and millions of small packages arriving every day, each needing accurate classification and duty calculation under rules that are reportedly unclear or incomplete. The potential for mislabeling goods, miscalculating duties, or just accidentally violating complex customs rules is enormous. It leads to massive delays, potential fines, and just operational chaos for these postal services.
So it's not just the tariffs themselves that cause the pause, but the lack of clear, actionable rules from the U.S. side on how to actually apply them that's forcing this drastic measure.
Exactly. To avoid wading into this operational minefield, as they called it, to prevent widespread mislabeling, miscalculation of duties, incurring massive potential fines for violating unclear customs rules. Postal operators like India's Department of Post, the UK's Royal Mail, France's La Poste, Germany's DHL Packet, they opted to just suspend most standard parcel shipments preemptively.
They're hitting pause until things get sorted out.
Basically, yeah. They're trying to prevent chaos, avoid financial penalties, and sidestep the inevitable flood of customer complaints that would follow if packages got stuck or hit with unexpected fees. Now, it's important to note, premium private services like DHL Express, FedEx International, UPS Worldwide, they are still running, but they come at a much, much higher cost. That makes them inaccessible for many small businesses and the everyday consumer who relies on those more affordable national postal services. This effectively cuts off a huge channel of affordable global commerce, at least temporarily.
This is fascinating because it isn't a traditional trade war response, is it? We're not seeing India or the EU imposing their own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods in response to this. So what's really going on here? Is this some kind of coordinated attack, or is it just a shared, maybe exasperated reaction to poor policy implementation from the U.S.?
That begs the question, doesn't it? And the sources note exactly that. There are no new retaliatory tariffs being announced, no public threats being made, no emergency filings at the World Trade Organization. It's very quiet on that front. Yet, the timing and the symmetry of these moves, virtually simultaneous pauses announced by two major independent trading blocs, it strongly suggests either some level of tacit coordination behind the scenes, or, at the very least, a powerful convergence of shared frustration and strategic intent between India and the EU. They happen to be two of America's largest trading partners.
So it's a different kind of pushback.
It's an interesting display of what international relations folks call soft power in action. It's a non-confrontational, yet potentially deeply impactful form of pushback against a policy they see as unworkable.
So their message isn't a direct, we'll hit you back with tariffs, but rather something more like, look, we won't play your new game if the rules aren't clear and fair, and we'll just have to let your own citizens feel the consequences of that lack of clarity.
That seems to be precisely the message, yes. Their stance appears to be. Until Washington clarifies its rules, provides a workable framework, maybe consults properly, cross-border parcel trades simply cannot continue as usual via their standard postal systems. Now, the operators insist the pause is temporary, subject to the resolution of these regulatory ambiguities. But even a temporary move like this has immediate and very real economic and political consequences, especially for consumers and small businesses in the U.S. By refusing to bear the operational and financial costs of U.S. policy, unpredictability, and regulatory ambiguity, India and Europe are effectively compelling Washington to confront the chaos its own policies might be creating, not just for foreign firms, but directly for its own citizens who rely on these imports.
It's a clever way to shift the burden, isn't it? Apply pressure without actually escalating into a full-blown tariff war.
Exactly. It shifts the burden and applies political pressure domestically within the U.S., all without firing a single retaliatory tariff shot.
And as you said, this isn't some abstract financial market issue playing out on Wall Street. This is about your package, your convenience, and potentially your wallet, affecting millions and millions of Americans directly.
You're absolutely right. This is not some abstract financial market fluctuation that only economists or trade lawyers track. This is about the delayed birthday gift for your child you ordered from overseas. It's about the specialized component for your weekend hobby project. It's the unique piece of art you found on Etsy from an international seller, or maybe just the affordable clothing you purchased from an international retailer online. Unlike, say, container shipping rates or complex financial derivatives, parcel delivery touches the average American directly and personally. A 2024 Pew Research report cited indicates over 60% of U.S. adults purchased goods from overseas in the past year, largely relying on these affordable postal infrastructures that are now paused.
60%. So for a majority of Americans, this is going to be a very personal, tangible hit. It really makes you think about how many small daily decisions and purchases are impacted by these huge policy shifts happening far away.
It truly is. Think about the personal examples the sources provide. A parent anxiously awaiting a child's birthday gift ordered from India that's now stuck. A vinyl record collector expecting a rare EU pressing that might never arrive. Or maybe a startup founder sourcing crucial, budget-friendly components from Bangalore who suddenly finds their supply chain cut off. It's not just about the money sometimes. It's about trust in the system, the convenience we've come to expect, and the habits we've formed. 3 things voters tend to value quite deeply. The sources highlight that while maybe only 15% of Americans own stocks directly, almost everyone has waited for a package to arrive. This widespread impact ensures the policy's consequences are felt by a very broad electorate.
This sounds like it could have very real political consequences then, especially with election cycles always seemingly around the corner.
It absolutely could, and that's precisely the point being made by our sources analyzing this pause. This kind of disruption politicizes the costs of protectionism in a uniquely tangible, personal way that abstract economic data often doesn't. The inflation narrative of 2022-2023 showed us just how quickly widespread economic inconvenience can morph into significant electoral backlash. And this visible impact, this parcel pause, is hitting just months before the 2026 midterms. That makes it a potentially significant political issue that could resonate deeply with everyday voters.
Because it's personalized and visible.
Exactly. It's personalized, it's visible, it's frustrating, and it affects daily life. That makes it politically explosive in a way that debates about GDP percentages often aren't. Now, when it comes to the political fallout from this parcel pause, we can definitely expect both Republican and Democratic camps to frame this very differently, creating a pretty robust domestic debate that likely puts U.S. policymakers in a, well, difficult position.
How do you anticipate they'll spin it for their respective bases? What are the likely narratives we'll hear?
Well, protectionist Republicans, for instance, may argue that this short-term pain, this inconvenience, is unfortunately necessary. Necessary to, say, rebuild American manufacturing, close tax loopholes allegedly exploited by large foreign e-retailers, and ensure fair trade. Their narrative would likely focus on long-term domestic industry, job creation here, and fair competition, framing the pause as a temporary sacrifice for a greater long-term national good.
Okay, that's one side. What about the counter-narrative?
On the other hand, free trade Democrats and perhaps business-friendly independents will likely counter that this is government overreach run amok. They'll argue it's harming American consumers directly, hurting small businesses that rely on imports, and negatively impacting the very middle class it might claim to protect. They'll emphasize the inconvenience, the increased costs to households, and the disruption to a thriving cross-border e-commerce ecosystem that benefits many Americans.
And what about the blame game internally? Who is taking the heat for the lack of clarity and the operational mess that apparently triggered the pause?
Well, the sources reporting on this indicate that U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, are already facing some pretty sharp criticism, both domestically and internationally, for a distinct lack of preparation and poor global communication regarding these new rules. This suggests maybe an internal accountability issue within the administration in Washington, where perhaps a major policy was enacted without a fully baked, clearly communicated implementation strategy ready to go.
Which left trading partners in the lurch.
Essentially, yes. In contrast, India and the EU, by simply pausing shipments due to this lack of clarity, have come across looking measured but firm. They didn't retaliate with tariffs. They simply refused to participate in what they seemingly perceive as a broken game, thus neatly shifting the burden of the resulting chaos back onto the U.S. system itself.
That's a clever, almost strategically passive move, isn't it?
Yeah.
It positions them as reasonable actors just responding pragmatically to an untenable situation rather than as aggressors starting a trade fight.
Precisely. It's textbook soft power in action. By refusing to bear the costs, both financial and operational, of U.S. policy, unpredictability, and regulatory ambiguity, India and Europe are compelling Washington to confront the operational chaos its own policies might be creating, and importantly, forcing that confrontation through the experiences of its own citizens. It's a powerful, non-confrontational way to exert influence, putting pressure on U.S. officials to provide clarity and stability without resorting to the traditional, often escalatory tit-for-tat trade measures.
So looking ahead then, what comes next? What are the likely future implications of this pause for consumers here, for businesses, and maybe even for other global partners who are watching this situation unfold?
Well, for American consumers, the immediate realities seem pretty clear based on the reports. Prices for many imported goods bought online will likely rise, either due to the new tariffs themselves, if shipments resume under new rules, or due to reduced supply and the increased costs of using those premium alternative shipping methods. Delivery times will almost certainly stretch significantly for anything coming via standard post, if it comes at all during the pause. And product options might shrink, especially from smaller international sellers who might just find it too difficult or too risky to navigate the U.S. market under these uncertain conditions.
So less choice, higher prices, longer waits.
That seems to be the immediate consumer impact, yeah. And remember, those premium private carriers like FedEx, UPS, DHL Express, they're still operating, but their capacity is limited and their rates are reportedly already climbing significantly due to the increased demand. That makes them less viable for many everyday consumers and small businesses. For businesses, particularly smaller ones here in the U.S. that rely heavily on international sourcing for components or inventory, or maybe sell their own products internationally via these postal channels, there will likely be a scramble to find alternatives. But long-term solutions like reshoring production back to the U.S. or finding entirely new domestic suppliers, those are neither fast nor cheap. They often take years and significant investment.
And what about this idea of the parcel pause becoming a blueprint? Could we see other nations using this kind of tactic more widely in the future if they face similar situations?
That's actually one of the most intriguing potential long-term implications highlighted. This parcel pause could absolutely become a kind of playbook, a blueprint, for other global partners looking for peaceful but effective ways to resist unilateral trade policies they find disruptive or poorly implemented. It's a powerful demonstration that even seemingly small bureaucratic changes, like altering customs rules for small packages when mishandled or poorly communicated, can cause significant global disruption with very tangible domestic consequences for the country making the change. India and the EU are effectively signaling that global trade, especially in our deeply interconnected post-pandemic world, is a two-way street, and that interdependence leaves very little room for unilateral improvisation without consequence. If Washington insists on changing the rules of the game, the message seems to be it must also accept the responsibility of clear communication, probably global consultation, and definitely operational foresight. Otherwise, the sources suggest the next box delayed at an American doorstep might just represent a future ballot box consequence, potentially impacting electoral outcomes down the line as voters connect these everyday frustrations to policy decisions.
Okay, let's zoom out now from the immediate trade disputes and these parcel woes to look at a deeper, perhaps more complex geopolitical landscape. One where ideology plays a central and profoundly misunderstood role, particularly now Washington views certain global hotspots. Our sources make it pretty clear that the current tariff tensions with India aren't just about trade numbers, steel imports or tech exports, or even solely about global energy dynamics, like who's buying oil from whom. There seems to be a much bigger, more intricate picture involving regional stability and ideology that Washington might be fundamentally missing in its foreign policy approach.
Yeah, what truly stands out here, according to the analysis we looked at, is how this ongoing tariff dispute with India has somehow been conflated with other entirely separate issues in some political discourse. Our sources clarify pretty unequivocally that these trade tensions have nothing to do with whether a previous administration claims it stopped an India-Pakistan war, a claim we'll get into, and it's not really connected to the conflict in Ukraine either. These are distinct, incredibly complex geopolitical realities, yet they often seem to get bundled together together rhetorically, creating a kind of muddled understanding of the underlying causes and motivations.
And the idea that India's recent increase in purchasing Russian energy is somehow at the heart of this specific tariff dispute. Is that accurate, or is that another potential misdirection, according to these sources?
Well, the sources we reviewed are unequivocal on this point. The argument that India's Russian energy purchases are the primary issue driving these tariffs is described as misplaced and potentially serving as a convenient deflection from other factors. The facts, as laid out, speak for themselves. China buys significantly more Russian oil than India does. Europe, despite its public condemnations of Russia, continues to buy large amounts of Russian LNG. And interestingly, the United States itself buys more Russian uranium than before the Ukraine war.
So everyone's buying Russian energy, basically.
The reality seems to be simple. Nearly every major power, driven by complex factors like economic necessity, existing infrastructure, and global market dynamics, still wants or needs Russian energy to some degree. So, to pin the current U.S.-India trade dispute solely on India's energy purchases is, according to this analysis, to ignore the broader global energy landscape and perhaps deflect from the core domestic economic arguments driving the U.S. tariff policy itself.
So if it's not really about these other geopolitical factors like Ukraine or energy buys, what is the real economic debate that Washington should perhaps be focusing on when it comes to the potential impact of these broad tariffs, especially concerning the U.S. economy itself?
The true debate, according to the sources we looked at, is squarely about domestic U.S. economics. They issue a really stark warning, actually. By pursuing policies like mass tariffs combined with other potential policies like mass deportations, the administration risks pushing the United States into stagflation.
Stagflation, that's that nasty combination of stagnant growth and high inflation, right?
Exactly. A dangerous and economically debilitating combination of economic stagnation, slow or no growth, and simultaneous inflation, rising prices. And this isn't some fringe concern. The sources state this is a worry voiced by virtually every leading economist across the political spectrum. The source material even humorously caricatures Peter Navarro as perhaps the only exception, plotting tariffs from a basement office. While satirical, it highlights the deep divergence between mainstream expert economic opinion and certain political narratives, underscoring the perceived potential for self-inflicted economic harm from these policies. And if we connect this back to the geopolitical landscape, the India-Pakistan flashpoint is presented as absolutely crucial for understanding what the sources describe as America's potential blind spot when it comes to global geopolitics, especially concerning ideology. The sources make a compelling and, frankly, somewhat unsettling argument about the profound ideological underpinnings of this particular conflict, something they suggest Washington fundamentally misunderstands or perhaps downplays.
What is that argument exactly? How is the India-Pakistan dynamic viewed through this specific ideological lens in the source material? And what does it reveal about America's perception, or maybe misperception?
Well, India is presented in these sources as being in many ways a mirror image of Israel. Both are democracies facing neighbors that openly harbor hostile ideologies aimed against their very existence as nations. This isn't just portrayed as typical border disputes or land disagreements, it's framed as something deeper, involving deeply ingrained existential threats based on ideology. Specifically, the sources highlight Pakistan's state-linked Ghazwa-e Hind doctrine.
Hind. What does it entail, according to the sources?
It's described as an Islamist doctrine envisioning the eventual military conquest of India and the forced conversion of all Indians to Islam. Now, this isn't dismissed as some fringe fantasy by the sources. They state it's repeatedly invoked by Pakistani political and military leaders as well as militant groups, and is treated as a serious, active ideological threat to India's pluralistic, multi-religious, and secular identity.
So following that logic, the sources argue that Kashmir, much like the situation in Gaza perhaps, isn't simply a territorial dispute that can be solved with political bargaining over land swaps.
Exactly. Kashmir, like Gaza in the Israeli context, is presented as not being fundamentally about land per se. Instead, it's portrayed as being rooted in these deeper ideological conflicts, much like how Iran openly calls for Israel's destruction. And when our sources use terms like spiritual warfare, they're attempting to describe something far deeper than just religious differences. It's framed as a clash of fundamental worldviews, an existential struggle where one ideology allegedly seeks the complete eradication or subjugation of the other, and this has very real and violent military implications. It's not just about lines on a map. It's portrayed as being about the fundamental right to exist, a nuance the sources suggest Washington often misses or prefers to ignore.
And certain U.S. actions, or perhaps inactions, seem to defy logic within this context, suggesting this fundamental misunderstanding plays out in real policy decisions or postures.
Yes, the sources point to some specific, perplexing actions that they argue demonstrate this ideological blind spot. For instance, one source was highly critical of allowing Pakistan's army chief, General Asim Munir, to reportedly issue nuclear threats against India while physically on U.S. soil during a visit that should have been purely diplomatic. Even more concerning, perhaps, is the repeated suggestion emanating from some quarters in Washington that the U.S. might somehow step in and solve the Kashmir issue, a notion the sources bluntly label as geopolitical illiteracy given the deep ideological roots described. The timing of the Pahalgam terror attack, for example, is highlighted as following soon after General Munir's alleged incendiary speech in Queens, New York. The sources draw direct links indicating a view that Pakistan's state apparatus actively nurtures and guides terror outfits, seeing them as virtual extensions of the ISI and Pakistan Army. This underscores the idea that Washington often fails to grasp or fully acknowledge the ideological links and systemic nature of such events, perhaps viewing them as isolated incidents rather than part of a larger ideologically driven conflict.
So, with such high tensions, especially after that Pahalgam attack mentioned, how did a ceasefire eventually come about between India and Pakistan? Was it U.S. diplomacy that proactively brokered it, as some narratives might perhaps suggest?
Well, what's truly fascinating here, according to the sources we consulted, are the uncontested facts surrounding the ceasefire, which they argue unequivocally reveal India's decisive and strategic role in shaping the outcome. After the Pahalgam terror strike, India reportedly retaliated swiftly and powerfully, with sources claiming they wiped out roughly a dozen terror camps located deep inside Pakistani territory. Immediately after these decisive strikes, India publicly announced its intent to de-escalate, essentially offering an off-ramp to Pakistan almost from the start, but crucially doing so from a clear position of demonstrated strength.
But Pakistan didn't just immediately take that off-ramp offer, did they?
No, according to the sequence described, Islamabad initially rejected India's direct offer, but later, seemingly taken aback by the swiftness and effectiveness of the Indian military retaliation, Pakistan apparently asked Washington, D.C. to mediate. The U.S. then conveyed this request to New Delhi. India, however, reiterated its consistent stance. Any resolution had to involve Pakistan talking directly to India. Ultimately, Pakistan did engage in those direct talks, and a ceasefire was agreed upon after these direct negotiations, shaped significantly by the new reality of India's demonstrated military capability and reach. In essence, India's willingness for a ceasefire was reportedly clear from the beginning, but its military actions created the necessary conditions for it to happen on terms acceptable to India, rather than relying on or waiting for external intervention.
So the U.S. played more of a messenger role in that specific instance, rather than being the proactive peace broker actively shaping the deal, which is a significant distinction from how it might be portrayed sometimes.
Precisely. The sources emphasize the U.S. did not proactively broker this specific peace deal, unlike its attempts in other conflicts, like Ukraine perhaps. It merely transmitted messages between the two parties after the key events had unfolded. Our sources even note that prominent U.S. political voices, like Senator J.D. Vance, publicly stated days before the ceasefire was announced that India had every right to self-defense and that the specifics of the conflict were essentially none of America's business, underscoring a degree of U.S. ambivalence or distancing at that critical moment. India's strikes reportedly revealed an ability to take control of Pakistani airspace, which was a shock to Islamabad, and clearly demonstrated India's growing military and economic dominance in the region. The ceasefire, therefore, was ultimately shaped by India's initiative and its demonstrated military capacity, not primarily by external mediation, which the sources argue often misinterprets the fundamental nature of the conflict anyway. And this whole situation raises an important question highlighted in the sources about Washington's fundamental understanding of these kinds of global conflicts. The material points to what it calls a critical and persistent blindness to Islamist ideology that hinders effective U.S. foreign policy in the region and beyond.
Blindness to Islamist ideology? That's a pretty strong claim. What exactly does that mean in the context of India and Pakistan, and how does it allegedly affect Washington's perspective and actions?
It suggests that Washington policy circles often struggle to fully comprehend, or perhaps are reluctant to openly acknowledge, the deep ideological underpinnings driving certain conflicts. They tend to view them through a more familiar, perhaps more comfortable, purely territorial, political, or transactional lens. They sometimes fail to recognize or give sufficient weight to what the sources describe as the spiritual warfare with real military consequences that countries like India and Israel, in their analogy, perceive themselves to be facing from certain neighbors. Pakistan's strategic culture, for instance, is described in one source as mirroring the thinking of groups like Hamas, allegedly rooted in an ideology that seeks not just political change or territorial adjustment, but potentially the destruction or subjugation of its perceived enemy, India, based on religious ideological grounds. This ideological dimension is presented as fundamental, yet often glossed over or minimized in U.S. foreign policy discussions focused on negotiation and compromise.
And the sources highlight what they see as a stark hypocrisy related to China in this context, which they argue further reveals this alleged blindness or inconsistency.
Yes, a glaring hypocrisy, according to one analysis. It points out that after a single reported terrorist incident in Beijing, China's CCP, with shocking swiftness and brutality, placed an estimated 1 million Uyghurs into detention camps, citing security concerns rooted in Islamist extremism. Yet, the same source notes, Beijing continues to provide significant military and economic support to Pakistan, a state whose apparatus is accused in the source material of cultivating and guiding terror outfits and openly espousing doctrines like Ghazwa-e-Hind. This inconsistency, the sources argue, reveals a potential double standard and a fundamental lack of clarity, or perhaps a willful blindness, in understanding and confronting the threat of ideologically driven state-sponsored terrorism when geopolitical alignments make it inconvenient.
So the argument is that to truly grasp India's perspective and perhaps forge a more effective and consistent foreign policy, America needs a significant shift in its fundamental understanding of these ideological drivers.
Absolutely. The core argument is, to understand India's perspective, America must try to view Pakistan's state-linked Islamist ideology, as India and Israel, in their analogy, reportedly does, not just as a political grievance or a competing nationalism, but as a form of spiritual warfare with real military consequences, unquote. Without this clarity, the sources warn, U.S. policies will likely remain reactive, inconsistent, and ultimately ineffective, missing the core motivations behind these conflicts and risking serious miscalculations. The sources also draw an interesting analogy to U.S. views on China's policy in Tibet. By often dismissing or downplaying the profound spiritual belief in the Dalai Lama's reborn soul, a core element of Tibetan identity, Washington's foreign policy establishment, much like the CCP, according to this view, reveals an inability or unwillingness to fully comprehend religious legitimacy and the deep cultural fabric of other nations. This spiritual illiteracy, as one source calls it, is presented as a critical blind spot that undermines effective diplomacy and understanding in many parts of the world where ideology and spirituality are central. So, the decisive Indian military response after the Pahalgam attack is portrayed as a significant milestone, maybe a turning point. It demonstrated India's capacity and apparent new resolve for decisive action, followed by a willingness for de-escalation, but only on its own terms, from a position of strength. It exposed Pakistan's vulnerabilities and forced them to engage directly. The core lesson the sources want us to take away here is that this is not simply a territorial conflict over Kashmir that can be mediated like a real estate deal. It's framed as spiritual warfare with military implications. The sources explicitly liken the India-Pakistan dynamic to that of Iran-Israel, both portrayed as potentially existential conflicts rooted in seemingly irreconcilable ideologies. Unless America achieves clarity on this fundamental nature, its policies, they warn, will remain reactive and inconsistent, failing to address the true drivers of the conflict and risking miscalculations in a dangerously volatile region.
Okay, so having explored the hard economics of tariffs, the hidden costs, and the deep, often ideologically charged geopolitics of regions like India and Pakistan, let's now turn to how India, specifically, is responding to these current trade tensions. And it's not primarily with tariffs of its own, interestingly. Instead, our sources highlight a surprising, maybe remarkably effective form of soft power pushback, often captured in some very insightful and frankly quite satirical and witty commentary. This is where things get truly unconventional and, honestly, pretty brilliant. So if tariffs are hitting economic systems hard and maybe revealing some geopolitical blind spots, how do nations respond when they perhaps can't or simply choose not to play by the traditional rules of retaliation? Our sources show India has a particularly, creative approach. It's almost like they're fighting a different kind of war altogether.
Yeah, what's truly fascinating here is the sharp contrast that's deliberately drawn in the commentary we looked at. While China is explicitly highlighted as the world's factory, excelling in manufacturing discipline, precision, capable of delivering 10,000 identical plastic ducks with synchronized, almost robotic efficiency. India's strength is described very, very differently. Its other edge, as the commentary calls it, is identified as creativity, services, a certain comfort with chaos, and crucially, free speech. These are all things the commentary humorously notes the Chinese Communist Party would rather staple to a chair and interrogate, suggesting they are fundamentally antithetical to its controlled, top-down system.
So that immediately tells you India's approach to global influence, at least in this framing, operates on an entirely different plane.
Exactly. A plane that traditional economic weapons like tariffs seem ill-equipped to counter. It's not about matching factory output. It's about leveraging a different set of strengths.
So it's not about physical goods and production lines for India in this particular context, but something far more intangible, much harder to quantify, and certainly harder to tax at the border.
Precisely. The commentary suggests that Trump's tariffs, or any tariffs really, target tangible goods, things like steel, soybeans, washing machines. These are physical products that cross borders, get inspected, and can be taxed. But India's fight, its primary form of engagement and influence in the satirical take, is with words, memes, and WhatsApp forwards, things that can apparently reach 3 continents before a president even finishes his Diet Coke.
That's quite an image.
It is, and it paints a picture of a completely different battleground, one where traditional economic levers like tariffs are largely ineffective. Why? Because you simply cannot put a tariff on an idea or a piece of software code or a remotely delivered service or indeed a viral meme. It's presented as a strategic defense that cleverly leverages India's unique cultural output and its massive, digitally connected English-speaking services workforce, demonstrating perhaps a profound understanding of where modern influence really lies.
Our sources paint such a vivid picture of India using these unique service-based strengths as a form of almost untouchable pushback. Can you give us some more of those specific, maybe humorous examples of how this other edge manifests in a way that's uniquely difficult for traditional tariff policies to even touch?
Oh, the commentary illustrates this brilliantly with these vivid, almost cinematic examples that really highlight the unexpected challenges for a traditional goods-focused tariff strategy. I mean, you can't put a tariff on a Zoom call, right?
Right.
So the source paints this picture. Imagine Indian yoga teachers zooming into living rooms in Nebraska, patiently teaching stressed-out corn farmers to inhale, exhale, and let go of their trade deficits.
Of course, that's fantastic.
It's an absurd image, deliberately so, but it makes a powerful point about untariffable services that completely transcend physical borders and directly engage with American consumers on a personal level. This isn't about shipping containers of goods. It's about exporting knowledge, culture, wellness, expertise, things tariffs can't stop.
And it goes beyond just wellness and yoga, right? It touches on core economic functions and even potentially political ones.
Yes, absolutely. The sources also talk about legions of highly skilled accountants sitting in Bangalore, crunching complex U.S. tax returns faster than anyone in Washington can spell tariff, or armies of Indian online tutors teaching American kids math so effectively that the kids start calculating how fast their parents' jobs are being outsourced. Again, it's satirical, but it paints this picture of a subtle, pervasive form of intellectual and economic influence that completely bypasses traditional trade barriers, like tariffs. The commentary even suggests a more hidden, almost subversive layer of influence.
Such as?
Well, with hypothetical scenarios like maybe Mar-a-Lago's own spa instructors secretly logging in from Pune to guide meditation sessions for the elite, or maybe clever young Indian interns sitting in Hyderabad at AB testing different versions of political campaign ads for maximum impact in U.S. elections. These are services, data analysis, creative work, all flowing freely over digital networks, rendering tariffs completely meaningless against them.
It's almost like a great hollowing out from within, as the sources sort of checkily describe it. Not through invasion, but through Wi-Fi.
Exactly. That's the core satirical idea. India doesn't need to invade militarily or even directly confront economically on tariffs. It just needs Wi-Fi. This represents a powerful, almost stealthy form of economic penetration and cultural influence that traditional tariffs, which are laser-focused on physical goods crossing borders, simply cannot touch or control. The sources are satirically suggesting that India is winning a different kind of war, a services war, a cultural war, an information war where its vast intellectual capital, its creativity, its English proficiency, and its digital connectivity are its main and highly effective weapons. It points to a fundamental shift in how power and influence might be exerted in the 21st century.
Now, this next part from our sources is just pure satirical genius, I think, to talk about memes. Memes as a weapon in international relations. How seriously should we even begin to wrap our heads around that concept. It sounds completely outlandish, but the commentary hints at something potentially profound underneath the humor.
That begs the question, doesn't it? And while it's presented completely satirically, the core idea that memes are like nuclear weapons of the information age, that once launched have no defense, except maybe logging off, is actually a pretty profound insight into the disruptive power of digital culture and information warfare in our modern era. The commentary argues, quite persuasively through humor, that you cannot tariff sarcasm. You cannot tariff free speech, at least not easily or effectively. These are intangible forces. They can shape public opinion, they can discredit powerful opponents, they can influence narratives globally in ways that traditional economic tools, obsessed with controlling physical goods, simply cannot comprehend or counter.
It highlights the vulnerability, maybe, of traditional power structures.
Absolutely. Vulnerability to agile, decentralized, often anonymous digital influence that operates outside the established rules of international trade and diplomacy.
So the satirical idea is that India could theoretically troll a powerful figure, like an ex-president, into political oblivion using purely digital means.
Yes, the satire suggests exactly that. With brilliant, biting humor, it envisions India countering not with tariffs on soybeans, but with a billion gifs of Bollywood actors shaking their heads in disapproval, flooding social media. Or maybe Trump's own speeches expertly remixed into infectious Bhangra beats that go viral globally, all before major news outlets can even finish writing their analysis pieces.
Oh.
This humorous exaggeration highlights the incredible speed, the potential virality, and the deep cultural resonance of digital content, especially memes, as a potent, asymmetric form of soft power. It's framed as a battle for hearts and minds, for narratives, for cultural relevance, not a battle for control of steel imports or manufacturing jobs.
And the sources even include a fictional Trump reaction to this imagined meme war. Can you share some of that? It sounds absolutely hilarious and perfectly illustrates the kind of disconnect the satire is pointing to.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's worth reading. The parody transcript describes a fictional Trump at a rally, lamenting being destroyed by yoga people. He then hilariously tries to announce he's going to put a 25% tariff on downward dog.
A tariff on downward dog.
Yes, and then calls for building a Trump wall for the internet, specifically to stop yoga live streams from entering the country, leading to the crowd chanting, "Ban yoga, ban yoga." It brilliantly illustrates the utter futility and the deep absurdity of attempting to apply traditional, physical, protectionist measures to intangible cultural flows and digital influence. It exposes how completely outmatched such an old-world approach would be in this new, unconventional battlefield. It emphasizes that while one might try to control physical borders, the digital realm operates under entirely different rules that India, in the satirical world, has apparently mastered. And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these satirical pieces, the fake op-ed titled Downward Dogged, the parody transcripts, they go beyond just simple humor. They offer a really sharp, incisive critique of how traditional frameworks for understanding trade wars completely miss the entire realm of cultural and intellectual influence. It's a deeper commentary on the fundamental limitations of conventional power in our increasingly interconnected digital world.
So it's not just about the funny images or the absurd scenarios, but there's a very serious underlying message about a fundamental shift in global power dynamics that maybe we're only beginning to grasp.
Exactly. The satirical idea of Indian yoga instructors, online tutors, and a remote accountant somehow outsourcing America's souls or leading to a spiritual colonization, that's a powerful, albeit humorous, metaphor. It suggests that while nations like China might dominate manufacturing and the trade in physical goods, India, in this narrative, is quietly gaining influence in far more profound and potentially enduring areas. Education, wellness, technology services, and even the very psyche and cultural landscape of the American people. This touches on something much deeper, much more personal than economic tariffs would ever hope to address or control.
And those leaked White House plans you mentioned, the parody of trying to fight back, that really drives home the sheer difficulty, the almost comical impossibility of fighting this kind of cultural battle using outdated conventional tools, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The humorous list of leaked White House plans includes things like failed attempts to tariff the warrior pose or to ban the greeting namaste, or maybe to rename yoga as freedom stretch to make it sound more American.
Freedom stretch.
Chuckles. These are presented as utterly absurd, of course, but they perfectly reveal the sheer impracticality, the category error, of applying old world trade tools to new world cultural and service exchanges. The very idea of attempting to tariff a spiritual practice or a simple greeting underscores the fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the threat or influence being discussed. The commentary even includes a throwaway line about Eric Trump supposedly asking if firewalling the internet means building more chimneys, just perfectly sealing the deal on the profound disconnect between traditional policy intention and digital reality.
And the call center coup parody, that's a particularly sharp jab, isn't it? Highlighting a potential reversal of traditional influence almost.
Oh, that scenario is pure satirical genius and deeply insightful in its absurdity. It imagines thousands of American households receiving automated calls, supposedly from Washington, D.C., but actually originating from a call center in Bangalore. And the call offers them presidential upgrades. Press 1 for Modi, press 2 for a random Bollywood star. And the punchline is that a staggering 63% of Americans supposedly press 2 for the Bollywood star.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant, laugh-out-loud way to highlight a satirical shift in perceived leadership, trust, and influence. It paints this picture where the very idea of national leadership or reliable information could be outsourced, if only humorously, showing just how pervasive and perhaps subtly effective this kind of soft power or cultural resonance can be. It's a clever subversion of who holds the perceived authority and maybe even the affection of the populace.
So what's the ultimate satirical conclusion here? In this unseen battle of tariffs versus, well, memes in yoga, how is victory defined? What's the final takeaway from all this clever commentary?
Well, the satirical conclusion offered is both profound and deeply resonant with our times. China may own the factories, but India, in this narrative, now owns the punchlines, the tax returns, and perhaps even the spiritual real estate of the American people. The fictional yoga teacher, Ramesh, is quoted perfectly summing it up in the commentary. Trump tried to fight us with tariffs, but we fought back with flexibility. And in the end, Ramesh says, the bend always defeats the break. This suggests that adaptability, intellectual prowess, cultural influence, and maybe just a good sense of humor are far more potent weapons in this new global landscape than rigid protectionist policies focused only on the past. It's a witty yet incredibly serious critique of how traditional power metrics GDP, manufacturing output, military might may fail to capture the full spectrum of global influence today. And perhaps it's a warning to those who underestimate the power of the intangible, the cultural, and the digital.
Wow. Okay, so today, we've journeyed through quite a lot. We started with the tangible economic impact of tariffs, really seeing how they function as a hidden tax on your household, potentially costing you upwards of $1,500 annually according to projections. We explored the immediate diplomatic fallout, like that unprecedented parcel pause initiated by India and the EU, highlighting how global trade operates on sometimes unexpected rules of engagement that can directly impact your online shopping experience. We then delved into the deeper ideological roots of conflicts in regions like India and Pakistan, revealing potential critical geopolitical blind spots in Washington's understanding of concepts like spiritual warfare and its profound military implications. And finally, we uncovered the surprising, often humorous but deeply insightful cultural counter-strategies that India in particular is depicted as deploying, where memes and yoga instructors become powerful, unterrifiable tools of influence that traditional economic levers simply can't touch. So what does this all mean for you, our listener, as you try to navigate a world increasingly shaped by these complex, interwoven forces? Where a simple tweet might in some ways be as impactful as a decades-old trade policy.
Yeah, that really begs the question, doesn't it? I think the insights today reveal more than anything that global interactions are far more intricate, far more layered than simple trade numbers or military hardware counts might suggest. It's a dynamic interplay of hard economics, traditional diplomacy, but also increasingly cultural soft power, information flows, and even ideological currents. What seems like a straightforward policy decision, like imposing tariffs, can have these cascading, often unpredictable effects, from your delayed package arriving from overseas to subtle shifts in geopolitical alignments on the other side of the world. Understanding these different layers, I think, helps us see that power and influence themselves are being redefined in real time, often in subtle and unexpected ways that directly impact your daily life and the broader global landscape you inhabit. So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. In this new era of complex global influence, where a delayed package, a shifting geopolitical ideology, or even a viral meme can genuinely move the needle on international relations and domestic politics, how do you think countries will adapt to these multifaceted challenges going forward? And perhaps even more intriguingly, what new, unexpected forms of power, influence, and maybe even resistance might emerge next? Forms that perhaps we're only just beginning to understand, but which could profoundly reshape the world as we know it in the years to come.